Newsnight now on BBC Two with Evan Davis. Evan Davis.
Morning.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say
The people of the United Kingdom have voted to leave the European Union.
I've got my country back. I'm not going to be here a lot longer. I'm nearly 80. But what I've got, I want to keep.
Should Cameron leave?
Good God, yes.
Now?
Well, by about 10 o'clock, I'd say, would be about right.
But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
You're not worried about what you're hearing this morning, about David Cameron resigning, about the strength of the pound?
No, not at all. Not at all, no. It's a good thing.
A letter of no confidence has now been tabled in Jeremy Corbyn.
We will begin to prepare the legislation that would be required to enable a new independence referendum.
Anybody that doesn't think this is big stuff needs to get their head around it.
I'm kind of thinking of moving to another country.
This is huge.
It was a noble idea for its time. It is no longer right for this country.
Chuffed a bit. We're better off out because the French don't like us and the Germans don't like us.
Shocked, bewildered, don't know what's going to happen next.
Well, you've got nothing. Nothing can get worse now. We've got now, so what can get worse than what it already is?
Thank you very much.
So, what now? It's the biggest financial story since the crash, a huge political story, a once-in-a-generation foreign policy shift, all in one day, not to mention the constitutional uncertainty around Scotland. We can keep calm, but carrying on as before, not really possible. The enormity of what happened has been sinking into voters on both sides today. We mustn't over-interpret the result. If a mere 1 in 50 of all voters had switched from Leave to Remain, we'll be having a very different conversation. But we mustn't under-interpret it either, and all that it represents. Is this, for example, the first vote ever to say it's not the economy, stupid, it's immigration? Is the real story here a revolution, the latest of a wave of insurrections sweeping the West, a challenge to the established order and the political class, the discontented getting their own back? Or should you view it as an intergenerational struggle? The polls showing under 45s voted in and over 45s wanted us out. And there's an aftermath of bitterness. One young man's tweet, "I'm so angry," he said. "A generation given everything, free education, golden pensions, social mobility, have voted to strip my generation's future." Well, for some, it comes down to nothing less than a culture war.
So who's corrupt and overpaid?
Yes, Europe.
Youthful urban liberals versus older social conservatives. The former worry that Britain will now turn its back on progressive values. The latter think it's time for their voice to be heard again. It's not as clean cut as that, of course, but that's where the argument goes. What kind of country will we now be? Well, it's for the history books to argue about the causes of this uprising. We're going to do something different tonight. We'll look ahead to what comes next. What's next for politics in this country? The two major parties both looking battered, both with leadership questions to be answered. What's next for Europe? How will the EU now choose to treat us? And how does our decision affect the EU? And what is next for the UK, with Scotland voting so differently to England? Well, of the three what nexts, politics comes first, as it shapes everything else. At a turbulent time like this, it might be great to have a Nelson Mandela to take over, heal the wounds, articulate a vision for the country, and negotiate a new arrangement with goodwill and good grace. Well, Donald Trump flew into Britain today, but he's not available. David Cameron is on his way out, and Jeremy Corbyn, many in Labour want him out too. It is an awful time to be a mainstream politician. I'm going to be talking to some of them in a minute, but first I'm here with our political editor, Nick Watt. I mean, Nick, in Westminster this morning, shock and awe.
Well, they were absolutely shell-shocked in Downing Street by this result. They had a simple thought: Project Fear would deliver them a second referendum win. But instead, what you saw was power and authority seep away from number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. You might have thought, for example, on a day like this, that the Chancellor would calm the markets. But no, that job was left to the Governor of the Bank of England, and you just had a couple of tweets from the Chancellor. In the case of number 10, we were talking to one Whitehall source who likened number 10 to a donut whose centre of the shell has fallen apart. And this source went on to say, no communication from number 10. We assume they must have gone to the pub. As dawn broke over the Thames today, Britain awoke to the most momentous shuffling of the political order since the Second World War.
Egypt's seizure of the Suez Canal led to worldwide crisis and the top
Suez, the devaluation of sterling, the defenestration of Margaret Thatcher.
We're leaving Downing Street for the last time.
Arguably, they were all trumped today when Britain stumbled out of the EU. Overturning 4 decades of assumptions about Britain's place in Europe was of an order of such magnitude that it made the resignation of a sitting Prime Minister a second-order issue. David Cameron's voice cracked as he announced his departure.
I love this country and I feel honoured to have served it. And I will do everything I can in future to help this great country succeed. Thank you very much.
Any hope the victor had of a Roman-style triumph was soon crushed when Boris Johnson was greeted by protesters as he left his house.
Overall, the changes that we will see will
The Prime Minister's nemesis looked funereal as the depth of what they had achieved sunk in.
I want to begin this morning by paying tribute to David Cameron, who has spoken earlier from Downing Street. And I know I speak for Michael in saying how sad I am that he has decided to step down. But obviously, I respect that decision.
Johnson owns the next few months, but his hopes of reaching number 10 may well hinge on whether his assurances of a seamless transition to life outside the EU come true. Gove insists he has no interest in the leadership, but a fellow Leave campaigner is not so sure.
Well, the Conservative Party's lucky. It's got so many talented people that there are dozens that come to mind. But my top 3 would be Michael Gove, Boris Johnson and Andrea Leadsom.
Do you think the next Conservative Prime Minister will have been a Brexiter?
Well, the Prime Minister has stood down because he feels that having backed Remain, he can't implement the will of the British people expressed in a referendum. That surely applies to anyone else who supported Remain.
Within months, the circus will have moved on. But for the moment, David Cameron finds himself as something of a hostage to his former allies as he accepts their timetable for a British exit from the EU. David Cameron had hoped to end his premiership as one of the great Conservative social reformers, but instead he finds power ebbing away.
I'm not sure whether we'd call it a zombie government, but certainly it feels a bit more like a caretaker government for the next few months. We have a government that had a massive legislative agenda, deficit reduction, prison, NHS reform, universal credit, all sorts of things, and a lot of it's been in hiatus already because of the EU referendum. Now, partly because of the leadership campaign, because you have a Prime Minister who's effectively an interim Prime Minister for the next few months, and because of summer and all of the concerns about the EU and what will happen there with negotiations, even more will probably be in abeyance for the time being.
You wait an age for a leadership crisis, and then 2 come along at the same time. A few hours after the Prime Minister announced his plans to resign, 2 veteran Labour MPs said they would lay the ground for a challenge to Jeremy Corbyn. Others share their concerns.
I understand that motion. I understand the concerns of Margaret and Anne and other colleagues of, looking at the result of yesterday. We went into this referendum campaign expecting 70 to 80% of Labour supporters and voters to vote Remain. I think we barely got 50%, and if he cannot demonstrate after this massive test that Labour can retrieve ground and he knows how to do it, there are more problems ahead. We could have a general election within 6 months, and at the moment, based on the outcome of yesterday, it's not looking good for Labour and not looking good in terms of Jeremy's leadership.
We've got our country back!
It was Independence Day for the winners, but the most unashamedly pro-EU party said that Britain should not give up on its European destiny.
And we heard Nigel Farage rather ungraciously before the result, when he thought he'd lost, saying there could be a second referendum. I'm not going to go saying that. If things change and the months go by and public opinion significantly changes, then, you know, we must make sure we keep all options open. We mustn't shackle ourselves to the corpse of a Brexit government.
For some, the European dream will never die. But for another generation at least, Britain's European journey is at an end.
Nick Watt. Well, here with me, the former Tory Chancellor, Ken Clarke, Suzanne Evans from Vote Leave, and Tristram Hunt, the Labour MP for Stoke-on-Trent, which actually voted to leave the EU with one of the biggest margins in the country. Ken Clarke, it's, you know, what, 46 years in politics, all devoted to the European project. You must feel gutted.
I do, yeah. Well, I started in politics as a very active Conservative student politician, supporting Harold Wilson's first bid to join the European community. So it's slightly ironic that 50 years later this neurotic argument's still going on, and we're actually leaving the European Union. But I actually am quite deliberately sort of trying to control my annoyance and my anger and my distress about the whole thing, because at the moment, you know, we now got to decide what we do next, which I think is what your programme's about. We have a caretaker government. We have no policy of any kind on what our relationship is going to be with the outside world, or Europe in particular. We don't know what we're going to do about immigration, but we know a lot of people were told to be very frightened about it. And so I think I have to count to 10 and decide, well, what the devil do we do now after this extraordinary, very narrow result?
Can I ask you just one other sort of personal reflection? Ed Miliband last year stood in an election against your government and he said, I am better for business because I'm not going to risk the nation's departure from the European Union. You now, looking back, must have thought it would be much better if Ed Miliband had won the 2015 election.
No, I don't think that. But I mean,
we wouldn't be here
all
if we won the
politicians
2015
of my generation
election.
think referendums are an absurd way of running a modern, sophisticated country. But there was no point in my emphasising that once we'd gone out and said we're going to have one, and there's no point in my emphasising that now because we've had one and we are where we are. I think everybody on both sides, and I'm sure people on both sides feel as passionately as I do, the country at the moment is in a period of great uncertainty. It needs a government. It needs a government that could start getting on with the business of running the country in several crises again, and it needs to decide, as we've got to negotiate with the European Union, what exactly do we want to negotiate? What's our negotiating?
Very quickly, the other two of you, general election, do you think a general election is required at this kind of time? Suzanne Evans.
Personally, I'd say not. While I'm absolutely ecstatic at the result, I do recognise that nearly half the country voted the other way and will be quite worried. And indeed, I've spoken to people today who do have concerns about where we go next. And I've been doing my best to reassure them, as of course have various other people today. I think a general election, for me, would bring in another level of uncertainty, which is probably best avoided.
And just briefly, Tristram, general election.
I think there's a high likelihood if we have a new leader of the Conservative Party, they'll want to develop their own mandate. So whether we have an election in autumn or whether we have an election in spring, and what they'll have to go to the country on is what their Article 50 renegotiation strategy will be. And I think they'll play that out.
I agree there's a serious risk of an election, and I think at the moment can't quite see how a government can be formed with a parliamentary majority, you know, to make the kind of changes that most of the Brexiteers have been talking about, but they don't know what they want, really. I actually think to go into a general election would add to the risks of where we are, more uncertainty, more chaos, and actually another daft and dreadful campaign, which might produce a very indecisive result, would be disastrous.
I'm so sorry, we haven't got much time. I do want to talk about who should be the next Prime Minister. Before we hear your view, Ken, of who should be the Tory leader, Tristram, who do you think it should be?
Who the next leader of the Conservative Party?
Yes, we will talk about who the next leader of the Labour Party.
From an outside, well, I mean, from a Labour perspective, I think I regard Boris Johnson as a very, very successful celebrity candidate who is a very, very clever man who has used that intelligence to appeal to some very base instincts, who, alongside Michael Gove, would seek to deliver a very neoliberal Tory Brexit. So I don't really want any of them. Is that all right?
No, that's okay. No, you're allowed to say that. Suzanne Evans, do you have a view?
It clearly has to be somebody who is passionate about Brexit and has a very clear vision.
So it can't be Theresa May.
So it can't be May, I would say, although I think it's a shame because she was clearly one of the front runners, and I think had she come out for leave. For me, I think Andrea Leadsom has been one of the standout stars of this campaign.
Had a good campaign,
and
sure.
certainly not as Prime Minister, then Chancellor for sure.
Because nobody has the first idea what the economic policy of the government is now supposed to be.
It's going to be the same as any other sovereign,
and nobody has the first idea
country,
what we are saying about immigrants and what we're not. There is a danger the country is going to fool around with another leadership election.
Well, it
and
has
having it does. But we need a balanced government. We need it being headed by somebody of balanced views, not just somebody who's good at photo opportunities.
Are you suggesting none of the Brexiteers who fronted the campaign are balanced?
We need people who can settle down to the serious business of government.
Theresa May. Is that Theresa May?
The whole referendum
Come on, give us the
campaign.
name.
When it was the whole referendum campaign, when it wasn't bashing immigrants, it was all the Boris and Dave show. And if the British, now they've caused a crisis for half the Western world, decide to have a real fun Conservative leadership
half
election
the Western
again,
world. Come on, just hyperbole, Kenny. Are you going to give us a name?
Are you going to give us a name?
I'm not going to give you a name.
Right. Let's turn to Labour. Because Tristram Hunt, the Tories are fighting each other. Labour seems to be fighting with its voters, and that must be a much, much more serious place for the party.
I think this referendum exposed some pretty big tensions within the Labour Party and the Labour movement. And where you see, for example, in Stoke-on-Trent, 70-30 out, and you contrast that with some of the votes in Brighton or Bristol or Norwich or Exeter, other Labour areas, we've got this divide between our traditional working class Labour communities who felt real pressure under globalisation in the last 10 years, have felt pressure on wage levels from immigration, feel discontent about the level of change, versus, as you said in your intro,
I understand what the problem which you're describing, but I mean, it's an enormous problem for a political party to find that its base, or half of the base, is basically completely at odds with it and doesn't view the world in the same way at all.
But we have had these problems in the past, and Ken will know there are any number of books written called, What's Wrong with Labour, The End of Labour, Will It Ever Come Back, in the 60s and 70s. And if you have someone with a convincing vision of Britain as a social democratic future, who people trust and want to put their country in the trust of, well, then you can overcome these problems. There's no doubt about that.
Jeremy Corbyn, does he meet that this job description?
Well, Ken said an interesting thing about the serious business of government, and we now face really serious, tough and difficult times. This is a national crisis, and the job of opposition, rather like John Smith during the Maastricht Treaty, is to provide strategic vision and forensic detail. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is very, very good at energising the base and making those who are already convinced of Labour ideals feel better about themselves. Whether he is the man to make sure that Labour values are at the core of a renegotiation strategy.
There was a very long way of saying he's not the right man for the job,
is he? Point here. Whether he's the man to have the Labour values at the core of the renegotiation strategy, I'm not convinced he has those capacities.
Right, we've got it. Suzanne Evans, there's a problem with trust of politicians, isn't there? And that's been one of the reasons why you've actually done very well. When exactly are we going to get the £350 million extra a week spent on the National Health Service that you promised in your campaign for the entire duration?
You said it was a lie this morning.
When is that going to happen?
It's gone already.
We actually promised £100 million a week for the NHS, specifically for the NHS.
I saw one thing, £350 million for the NHS.
I saw it on a bus.
We said 350 million we could spend on our own priorities, like the NHS. And then those leads made a specific proposal to say 100 million for the NHS. And that is exactly the kind of cash injection that the NHS needs.
When are we going to get the 100? When are we going to get the 100 million a week extra on the NHS?
When we leave the European Union. So let's say that will be 2-3 years' time.
Do you not think that there's just a possibility that the very things that have brought the mainstream politicians into such disrepute and low regard and the lack of trust and nothing they say is believed is now about to hit you and all of those who made that case?
No, I don't think. The British electorate made their decision. They looked at Project
Fear,
and
a little
they looked at Project Hope, and they chose Project Hope.
There wasn't an asterisk saying, read this bus very carefully, because we're not saying 350 million.
It wasn't the worst. I mean, both sides. The campaign was dreadful.
Yes.
So the public got angry and confused, and were no better informed when they finished than when they started, which is why a lot of older people in particular were so angry with the politicians, anti-establishment, and it's a protest vote, a lot of this. The worst thing they did was all these Syrian refugees. Britain has complete control over how many Syrians come here and how many don't. We did on Wednesday. We do now, nothing to do with the EU, whether they're admitted and settled here. They had a whole poster showing thousands
we
of
have
them
to leave it there.
in.
Let's not go back over the campaign.
It's disgusting. No, I'd rather not go over there. Okay? We need the right man to reunite the party and the country. We need a policy, and the sooner the better.
Thank you all very much indeed. Well, of course, alongside the politics is economics. Famously, we like to describe ourselves as the 5th largest economy in the world. Today, we actually came close to being the 6th. The pound has fallen, you see, so when you convert our pound-based national income into dollars, it isn't what it was. Well, the financial gyrations were considerable. Some companies' shares were pummeled in the expectation that things will get difficult. Our business editor, Helen Thomas, is here. Helen, take us through some of those gyrations.
So you heard about the meltdown. There's ample cause for concern, but there are the odd crumb of comfort out there. So the pound, our best barometer for the overall confidence in the UK economy. So you can see here, it surged higher last night as hopes built for a Remain victory, and it then plunged. Absolutely huge move for a currency. No. But later in the day, it found a level. It stabilised around 137 to the dollar. Stock markets, similar story. So here you can see a very, very dramatic drop at the open of the market.
Right on the left there, yeah, just on the left. Yeah.
Both for the FTSE 100 and the more UK-focused 250. Banks and property stocks very hard hit, but as you can see, the markets then came back and recovered. Now, so what we didn't see was this sort of downwards panicked spiral that would indicate a total loss of confidence in the UK. Having said that, it was a really tough day, and that reflects investors marking down their outlook for the UK.
No, that's all the sort of the acute crisis. Some might say the worrying thing is not getting through the next week. It's the sort of the longer term.
Well, and we may be in this sort of slow grinding process of figuring out what the economic hit's going to be. Now, we know some of the areas of concern because the Bank of England helpfully told us last week. So they said, while consumer spending has been solid, there is growing evidence that uncertainty about the referendum is leading to delays to major economic decisions. And they mentioned commercial and residential real estate transactions, car purchases and business investment. Now, the concern is that those areas that were already slowing, the shutters just come down. And most economists I've spoken to do think we're in, we've got a slowdown in store, possibly a recession. The question is how severe. Now, let's leave aside any risk of an outright crisis. You can still have a pretty ugly outcome if business investment and hiring dries up very quickly. You can see here business confidence was already falling into the vote. So in that scenario, unemployment starts to rise, people worry about their jobs, banks pull back on lending, partly because they're worried about loans being repaid. That hits confidence and consumer spending. Meanwhile, a weaker currency means higher inflation, and the Bank of England, which targets inflation, may not feel it can react aggressively to try and stimulate the economy.
It does get a bit confusing. Is there any sort of more sanguine scenario you can paint?
Yes, it still probably involves business investment falling on the back of the vote, but a weaker pound could boost exports. And more importantly, the Bank of England might say, we're not going to worry about inflation for now. We're going to look through that. They could cut rates, they could stimulate the economy in other ways. Maybe they've got enough tools left in their toolkit to do that. The irony is the Governor, Mark Carney, who's had a pretty hard time of late, he is crucial to how this all plays out.
Helen, thanks. Well, look, the next of our what nows is Europe itself. After the French Revolution, other royal families worried about how to keep their heads, and there's perhaps a bit of that on the continent. And worry they might about keeping their jobs. If any Eurocrats were still harbouring dreams of creating a European superstate, Britain has shown that the old concept of the nation-state is not going down without a fight. And critically, there's now the looming question of what our relationship with the EU might be. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is in Brussels. Good evening, Mark.
Evan, look, the thing that's defining attitudes here is a fear of contagion. Now, we heard Marine Le Pen, some Dutch Eurosceptics, others as well in Europe welcoming today's result, but none of them are in power right now. and none of them is in a position to deliver an in-out referendum in another European country anytime soon. But the attitude that seems to be dominant here, we've certainly heard some of the big hitters in the Brussels machine voice this attitude, is that Brexit should happen not just quickly, but in a very tough or exemplary way. In other words, they want the other countries in Europe that may be watching to see the Brits go out on very tough terms. Fascinating insight tonight from Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, very influential. A leaked Brexit plan of his suggests trade terms and association agreement, not like Norway, as some people had been discussing in the UK, not like Switzerland, more the sort of deal that Turkey or Canada might be negotiating in the latter case. So very tough terms, all to do with trying to head off a risk which even last night almost nobody in this town really had got to grips with the idea was about to hit it.
Les Britanniques vont-ils claquer la porte de la Maison européenne?
Die deutsche Presse ist in ihrer Haltung zum Brexit sehr eindeutig.
In the city at the heart of the EU, they woke up to the day that ever closer union died.
Ja, det gör vi. Om ni ser bakom oss så har vi en bild på 10 Downing Street. Och
across the airwaves and in many languages, that dread news sank in. With markets plunging across many countries, the woman styled Queen Europe by some called for calm.
Was die Folgen dieses Einschnitts in den nächsten Tagen, Wochen,
What the outcome of this watershed will mean to us in the coming days, weeks, months and years will depend on us. If we, the other 27 member states of the European Union, are capable and willing not to rush into any quick and easy decisions which would only further disunite Europe. But if we are capable and willing to assess the situation calmly and soberly in order to come to a joint decision on this basis.
At the Commission, leaders of the European institutions met to calibrate their response. And very soon it became clear that there would be no further offers to Britain.
We're already hearing voices here from the other 27 members of the EU that they should force the pace of Brexit in order to protect their own economies and political systems. And now we're going to hear from the bosses of the union's big institutions, and it'll be fascinating to see to what extent they think the union should drive a tough exit bargain with the UK.
For the man running the European bureaucracy, even the words to describe this moment seem to stick.
The British people express its views on their next situation. We now expect the United Kingdom government to give effect to this decision of the British people as soon as possible, however painful that process may be.
As for what it meant for the remaining 27, watch this.
Is this the beginning of the end of the European Union?
No. Thank you. Thank you all.
Blunt, but very much to the liking of the non-British journalists and officials. So Europe is in the deepest of crises as consultations begin prior to a Brussels summit next week. And there are already suggestions by many players here that any deal should be exemplary, with the UK denied access to the single market.
It's a consequence of the British vote, because the single market or the European Economic Area includes also the free movement of labour. That was the problem in the referendum. So I think that the only way to establish a new relationship between Britain and the European Union is using a trade agreement, like Europe has a trade agreements with a number of countries.
There's a statue just outside the Commission. It shows a step into the unknown. And on the day that the Brexit earthquake hit this town, it's rarely seemed more apt.
Mark Urban there. Well, earlier I was joined by Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former Chief of Staff. Did he think the decision to leave was irreversible, or was there still a route he could see where Britain would retain some kind of membership of the EU?
Well, I think this was a vote against something rather than a vote for anything. It was a vote against our current relationship with the EU, but it wasn't a vote for what sort of new relationship we should have. So I must say, I think that David Cameron is right to delay the start of negotiations until there's a new Prime Minister. But I would go further than that. I think any new Prime Minister needs a mandate for a negotiation. He has to set out what he's for. What sort of new relationship are we going to have with the EU? Are we going to be Norway? Are we going to be Canada? Who are we going to be? And I think that's very, very important that they get that mandate from an election. So I don't think you can really start negotiations until there's been an election, not just the choice of a new Tory leader.
OK, but that raises a lot of issues. So hang on, is it possible a party could go into an election saying, we're in, we're just going to ignore the referendum and we'll just negotiate us to remain?
Of course you can. That's what elections are about. You go for an election in a mandate. One of the many reasons Mrs Thatcher was against referenda was because she thought you should decide this in representative democracy through an election. But the main point here is this is a vote against something. It's not a vote for something. The Brexiteers were completely divided on what they wanted. No one knows what they mean. So someone's got to set out a positive mandate and they've got to get a vote for it.
Right. Now, look, a lot of the Europeans are saying they want this to happen quickly. The path you're describing, and indeed the path that the Leave campaign has been describing, is one that takes, well, one that takes quite a lot of time. We're waiting months before the negotiation gets going. Do you think we can really keep our European partners waiting that long?
I think we'll have to. I mean, David Cameron has already set out the timetable as far as he's concerned, and it's only us who can start Article 50, not them. So I totally understand why they want it to be quick, because the uncertainty is hurting them, not just us. But in the end, they're going to have to wait for us. And I think we would be sensible, A, to have a negotiating position, B, to have a new Prime Minister, and C, for that Prime Minister to have a mandate for what he's negotiating. This is really important about our future. Right. You can't just go in there, not clear what you want.
Now, the other critical thing is how hardball do you think they're going to play with us? Because already we've heard reports of some saying the Norway option, forget it, you're not going to get the Norway option, that's not on the table, you are going to be properly out. Now, what do you think the European Union, what line will they take? How tough will they be?
Well, they're not going to try and punish us because they want to have good relations with us. But the point is that they have their interests. They're going to meet at 27 without us next week to start working out what their position is. And their main priority is to keep the EU together. It's to stop the EU disintegrating. So they're not going to offer us anything that will encourage the Dutch or the Finns or the Danes to leave. So they're not going to offer us some super deal outside the EU, because otherwise they'll start losing other people. So that will be the last thing they do. They've got to take care of their interests, and we've got to fight for ours.
Yeah. And bluffing, I mean, do you think there's been some bluff over the last few weeks in the run-up to the referendum?
Well, I kind of hope so. If you remember, Boris Johnson said before he became the leader of the Brexit campaign, he said his preferred option would be to have a new negotiation and a new referendum, that the referendum would get us a better deal. So I'm hoping that he becomes leader of the Tory party, which I'm not hoping, but if he does, then he will have that mandate. He can go off, make a negotiation, and then have a new referendum. Remember, the Irish have done that twice this century. They voted against the treaty, had a second vote, and voted for it. Now, it seems very unlikely at the moment, the EU saying no to it, the Brexit campaign saying no to it, but that is one option when we go forward and when people realise quite how ghastly the alternatives are.
We've been talking about Britain and its relationship with the EU. Let's just briefly talk about the EU itself. How dangerous is the British vote for other countries, for the existence of the EU?
Well, it is a threat to the existence of the EU because it's going to encourage other Eurosceptics, and you can see who the friends of the Eurosceptics are. They're people like Le Pen, they're people like Trump. Those sort of people are going to be agitating to break Europe up, and of course the European governments are going to resist that, so it is a problem for them. Even leaving that aside, what's going to happen to Europe without Britain is it's going to become less liberal, it's going to become more integrated, and it's going to become more German. And that's going to worry lots of countries in Europe. That's why they wanted us to stay in. That's an inevitable consequence of us leaving.
Jonathan Powell there. Well, to pick up on that, I'm joined by the journalist and broadcaster, the French journalist and broadcaster, Christine Krent, and one of the leading lights of the Leave campaign, Dan Hannan. A very good evening to you. Christine, how does all of this look from France this evening?
Well, it looks pretty ghastly. But at the same time, listening in to the very interesting discussion you just had, Evan, I think you shouldn't underestimate the determination of the key member states on the continent not to let the Brits play the fiddle, determine the timetable, and, you know, we should just sit and wait for them to actually act. I think very much will depend on what happens on Monday when Madame Merkel meets in Berlin with François Hollande, the Italian Prime Minister, and Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council. I think that you will hear what the tone will be, and again, as has been said by our Brussels correspondent, there's that series of meetings next week. And again, you know, the European Union had been functioning for 17 years before Britain was accepted in. So I think there's a degree of arrogance at times, if I may, even at a late hour in the night.
Wouldn't be the first
sort of
time.
Thinking that we're going to disintegrate after this rather ghastly result.
Can I just push you? Sorry to interrupt. Can I push you? I mean, David Cameron is stepping down. It's going to take a good 2 or 3 months to elect a new Prime Minister, a new leader of the Conservative Party. No one really feels that David Cameron can do the negotiation. You're going to have to wait 3 months before this starts, aren't you?
Yes, but do you think that people in Brussels will just sit and wait? I think the process is going to be so complicated. The economic and financial costs, we've seen nothing today. Of course, the pound lost a great deal of value, and the markets will be shaken for quite some time. So I think there will be a lot of work being done in the meantime. And, you know, it's not going to be done by the snap of the finger. But again, I think on the continent, there's also this idea that the British people, especially the older generation, the ones who really have deprived the young ones of all the benefits of Europe, they are going to feel the brunt. And that is something which on the continent will be closely watched, especially by those Eastern European countries, which may, I remind you, Britain wanted so much inside the EU. Indeed. And now complains about immigration
Christine, let me put
from
your points,
Eastern Europe.
Let me put your points to Dan Hannan. Dan Hannan, firstly, they don't want us to take all this time and sit around thinking about it. They just want us to get on with it, and that's a perfectly reasonable request, isn't it?
Well, you've already answered that point, Evan. We have to wait until there's somebody to do the negotiation, so it can't start until that's taken place. I think getting this right matters much more than the time. And by getting it right, I mean being fair to our friends and allies on the continent, as well as getting a deal that is in our own interest. And it would be crazy to rush into something after 43 years at the expense of getting something that's mutually satisfactory.
Jonathan Powell said we need to have an election. You can't. We haven't yet worked out what the plan is, what the model is. Do you agree with that?
No. I mean, one of the reasons that Brussels is so unpopular is because it's seen to be contemptuous of public opinion. It swats aside referendums. It's incredible that less than 24 hours after the result, we've already got people trying to undo it. But what I would say, if I may sort of temper or soften what I've just said a little bit, although plainly we have a verdict that says that we are going to leave the European Union, it was a narrow majority. 48% of people voted to stay in. Yep. Scotland voted to stay in.
50-50, yeah.
Right. Northern Ireland, Gibraltar voted to stay in. We who are on the winning side have to be cognizant of the extent to which opinion is divided. We have to try and carry as many Remain voters with us. And that may well mean that quite a lot of the existing arrangements remain in place and that we try and find a status that both Leavers and Remainers can live with.
I've heard you talk about this, and it sounds like you, Daniel Hannan, I don't know whether you're speaking for Vote Leave or for Boris Johnson or for anybody else, it sounds like you are veering towards something closer to the Norway option as a compromise between the 48 and the 52 in the single market. Yeah?
Right. My issue with the EU has always been the lack of sovereignty, the lack of democracy. Yeah. Of course there are economic issues as well. It wouldn't be exactly Norway, obviously. We're a very different country. We're 65 million rather than 5 million. But the idea of staying within a common market but outside the political integration, I think that is feasible, yes.
And that means free movement of people.
It means free movement of labour. It doesn't mean EU citizenship with all the acquired rights.
I'm sorry, we've just been through 3 months of agony on the issue of immigration, the public have been led to believe that what they have voted for is an end to free movement.
Here is a very, very important point. From the moment we joined, we had the right to take up a job offer in another member state. You had a legal entitlement if you presented your contract. Now, that changed with Maastricht. When EU citizenship was introduced, people were given legal entitlements to live in other countries, to vote in other countries, and to claim welfare and have the same university tuition and so on. That bit, I think, is going to change. That means that we can deport people.
Why didn't you say this in the campaign?
Listen, I said that at
why did you not
every
say in the
single
campaign that you were wanting a system, a scheme where we had free movement of labour? Come on, that is completely at odds with what the public think they have just voted for.
I have just spent 4 months addressing rallies virtually every day, and at every one I would say, do not imagine that if we leave the EU, that means zero immigration from the EU. It means we will have some control over who comes in and in what numbers.
You've given the impression. The words take back control.
It's all there on YouTube. You can see it all.
Your campaign has given the impression that we will not be able to get immigration down to tens of thousands if we're out inside the EU. I think most people would say that gives the impression we will get it down to tens of thousands if we're outside the EU.
No, we've always been clear. We want a measure of control. It will be for a future Parliament to determine the numbers and to determine, how many students, how many doctors, how many family reunifications, whatever. But I don't think anyone's ever tried to put a number on it. That's obviously going to depend on the state of the economy at the time.
Dan Hannan, thank you very much. Christina Krent, thank you. I had meant to come back to you, Christine. We're out of time, but I hit a nerve there with Dan Hannan. Thank you so much. Thank you. OK, there's one other potentially momentous area to look at tonight. It's the UK itself. Time to dust off those old disunited kingdom cliches that were so popular during the Scottish referendum. And let's go to Scotland now. Kirsty is in Edinburgh tonight. Kirsty can give us a flavour of the talk in Scotland about a second referendum there. Kirsty.
Well, first of all, after such a decisive vote in Scotland to remain, this country feels a bit like it's in limbo. People are actually bewildered and some of them devastated that England voted to leave the European Union. And now Scotland, in a way, is unable to move forward. Nicola Sturgeon says that an independence referendum is highly likely, but she can't afford to lose again. And she herself has said there's no guarantee that people that voted no in the first independence referendum and voted to remain in the EU would vote independence for Scotland. So there are so many questions. What would the impact be in the Scottish economy? Look what happened to the pound after to oil after the last referendum. Would we really have a closed border and tariffs when we trade 64% of our trades with the rest of the UK? And what currency would Scotland use? All these unknowns. Can't use the pound, won't use the euro. On the other hand, for many people in Scotland now, membership of the European Union is a fundamental, it is non-negotiable. So the SNP is looking for a period of calm. But Nicola Sturgeon had absolutely no option but to address the question of an independence referendum straight away this morning.
The manifesto that the SNP was elected on last month said this: the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. Scotland does now face that prospect. It is a significant and material change in circumstances, and it is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table, and it is on the table.
From here, the United Kingdom seems a very different place, and Scotland is very much another country. Now there's a greater period of uncertainty north of the border than there is in England. The mechanics of a second referendum are not yet clear, but it's unlikely that Westminster would deny Scotland a fresh independence vote because, from the Shetland Isles to the borders, the majority wants to stay within the European Union. There's a sense of unreality here today. People can't quite believe their southern neighbours would be such worlds apart.
I can't believe we've done this. I'm very scared, especially with the Tory government that we have at the moment. And I think especially in Scotland, where we don't have much of a voice in the UK at all.
Do you feel now that we're very different in Scotland from England?
Yes, I think there's going to be a split. We've been in and out. I think there'll be a split.
The roots of our relations with Europe are long and deep. The Auld Alliance, the treaty between the French and the Scots, was signed in the 13th century. And Scotland has a long tradition of sending its sons and daughters overseas, all over the world. And we, in turn, have welcomed many different nations here. Russians, Italians, Poles, Pakistanis. And immigration just does not seem to be the same issue here as it is south of the border. Why do you think it is that immigration doesn't seem to be such an issue as it is in England?
I think that Scotland, as a race of people, we're just kind of more multicultural. I think our culture's more varied if you think about sort of storytelling, music, anything like that. And I just think that we are more accepting of new ideas here.
Are you Scottish or French?
Neither of two. I'm Italian.
You're Italian.
Yeah. Working in a French van.
And tell me, do you feel welcome in Scotland?
This morning when I came out of my flat, I was feeling a little bit less welcome. But I think that they vote for stay, no?
Yes.
So I think I will try to feel welcome anyway, because in fact, I'm welcome, maybe.
In 6 weeks' time, the world's eyes will be on Edinburgh for another reason. People will come from all over the world to the biggest international arts festival on the planet. And the festival was set up in the wake of the Second World War to encourage cultural relations between Scotland, Britain and Europe, to make sure that another war in Europe would be unimaginable. Nicola Sturgeon made it clear today that she wants to build a consensus in the country around a referendum. Now, it is possible that senior figures from other political parties would be part of that consensus, preferring finally to live in an independent Scotland within the European Union rather than an increasingly disunited kingdom divorced from the EU.
Kirsty there in Edinburgh. Now, Scotland-England is one division, young and old is another, but there's more going on too. There's an anger in large parts of the country that have not felt blessed by the benefits of globalisation, in contrast to bustling metropolitan hubs like London or Manchester, which voted Remain. And that schism has asserted itself to the shock of those at the top. Filmmaker Nick Blakemore has spent the last couple of days in Burnley, which voted 2/3 for Brexit, to see what was motivating voters there.
We won't lose control, we have lost control.
But for me it comes down to when we vote somebody in, whoever gets in the government, they make the rules. And at the moment, there's somebody above them. That's why I'm going to be voting to leave.
What really gets me is this, yeah? I fought for this country in '82.
Fair play.
Right? This government now is going immigrants. Here we go. Tick. They can all come in. Oh, I don't want it. Send them back home. We joined the EU for one thing, yeah? To have a better life, yeah? Hey, hang on.
Go on.
And then it comes to light, it's not a better life.
Vote for hope. That was the thing the paper. Do not vote for fear, vote for hope. Vote
You
to
can't
leave
vote
the
for
European
hope.
Union.
There's no hope nowadays.
We've had enough of the Tory scenario, the austerity, the cuts.
Why is that the fault of Europe?
The minute this referendum's over, and if Remain win, that's it. Our NHS is gone.
I think we should leave and give it a try. And we should get our independence back because it's just got absolutely out of hand.
It has. I've got to admit, it's the one thing. It came down to democracy, sovereignty, and the NHS.
There's good and bad. There's a lot of people come from abroad and they've done good for this country.
Exactly.
I was born in Germany. I'm
Precisely.
a foreigner myself.
We're not little Englanders. We've always looked outwards.
England was the greatest thing I've ever known when I came over here. And you were free, and if you worked hard, you got rewarded. Right?
Correct.
I never had a day's benefit or anything, never taken anything out of this country. I'm 83 years of age, and all I can get is single poll tax allowance. Not that I need it, I've got food in my belly, I'm getting by, and I'm not complaining.
Precisely.
Because when I look round, there's a lot of folk worse.
Yeah.
But I do object of people that's worked all their life, just stuff being taken off them.
None of us know what the future holds. I think that's why everyone is undecided.
This
Nobody knows what's going to happen.
My main point is you can't base your argument on a country and an entire superstate that hasn't got your best interests at heart. And that is the be-all
That's my
and
main
end-all.
reason for leaving. Well, who else is going to look after our country but us?
Precisely.
Oh, here we go. Good evening and welcome at the end of this momentous day when each one of us
has had the chance to say what kind of country we want to live in. At 10 o'clock, the polling stations close after weeks, months, years of argument.
The BBC is forecasting that the UK has voted to leave the European Union after more than 40 years.
Come on in.
Hello.
Come on in. I want to...
Come out first. Tell me, what's your reaction?
I don't know yet. I haven't switched it on. I put these out and I'm hoping I'm not going to look stupid. I'm really, fingers crossed, hoping I'm not going to look stupid.
The BBC are calling it for leave.
Really?
Yeah.
Seriously?
You need to put the telly on. Tanya, just tell me what's your reaction to that?
I'm over the moon. I don't know what to say. We did it. Everybody woke up in time. Everybody listened. Everybody understands. Yes, it's going to be rough at the beginning, but we've done it.
Some views from Burnley there. Well, with me now, two historians, David Starkey and Kate Williams. From The Times, Tim Montgomery, and the writer and equality campaigner, Paris Lees. Paris, what's your reaction as you watch that?
I recognise those towns. That's where I'm from, Evan. And I think these people are going to be really upset when they find out that they've been lied to. I think it's misguided. Obviously, the people have voted with good intentions, but I think we are being led down a very dark path.
Let's just ask whether the nation is in some way historically unusually divided. Kate, do you think we're in a unusual state?
I do think we're incredibly divided. I think this is the biggest historical event, I mean, the most divisive event since the Civil War, and I think it's the most historical event since the Act of Union itself. I mean, we see divisions here between North and South, between young and old, between the fact that Scotland is going to have a referendum, Northern Ireland, concerns about, Martin McGuinness is saying about joining together, and we know that a Scottish referendum is probably going to trigger questions about a referendum in Wales. So we're seeing massive divisions, and when we actually see a petition getting a lot of people's signatures saying that London might actually set up as a separate city-state.
I think it's a joke, though.
I'm not entirely sure.
I'm not entirely sure. I think there is. I mean, there is some joking in it, but there is some that I think shows the level of the divisions. It's huge.
You're both Remainers, and now you two are both Brexit supporters. David, do you think the nation is historically divided at the moment?
It is, but I think Kate is slightly exaggerating. I can think of Ireland. I can think of Roman Catholicism. I can think of all sorts of things that have split us. Even the whole question of whether we fought the Nazis or not. You know, the country was hugely divided. I think the more interesting question is why this has happened. And it seemed to me your Burnley film was absolutely right. What has happened is the European Union is a proxy. It's a proxy for deep discontent with experts, with the political class, and so on. And I think it's also the fact that the political parties have been led for the last nearly 20 years by leaders, Blair on the one hand and Cameron on the other, that have thought it was very clever to kick their supporters in the goulash.
Do we need to, if it's a proxy, was it the right thing to get out of it? If it's just a proxy, you're implying it's like, well, let's just kick something and that's the EU's over there, let's do that.
I think an awful lot of people actually voted on that basis.
Right.
And it's very important we recognise that, which of course also allows for the kind of point that Daniel Hannan was making, that perhaps we could begin to reunite as a very real possibility. And I think that what we've got to do is something which no recent government has had the courage to do. We've got to rediscover a sense of a national interest. Britain has spent the whole of its time arguing we've got to be good. We've got to support European rights because otherwise the Russians will misbehave. We've really got to start to do a de Gaulle.
Tim, is it the voters we saw there in Burnley are actually the ones political parties are finding it quite difficult to reach. Any political party, are they?
Boris didn't.
What is the answer to that? Because they're not natural Conservative voters. Your party's nowhere near them.
Sure, and you talk about Britain being divided, but I'm currently based in Washington for The Times, and I'm of course seeing the whole Trump phenomenon over there. We're all seeing the Trump phenomenon, and I think we're sort of 6-7 years after the global crash now. And I think immediately after the global crash, people just wanted governments that stabilised the situation. but now there's the hunger for reform and remedy. And I think we are seeing that right across the world.
Can I just make
today's revolt, yesterday's revolt by poorer Britons, and they were the overwhelming explanation for why we're leaving the European Union. That has to be heeded. This isn't just a vote to leave the European Union. This is a cry for help from a huge proportion of our population who think politics has stopped working.
And it is a vote against austerity, I absolutely agree. But when you think of places like Wales has got 500 million subsidy, huge votes against austerity. They talked about poverty. We didn't really see much talk about sovereignty in the same way. And the concern is that these people, it is not going to give them any, it's not going to improve the life of Burnley.
You're making a very elementary confusion. You're assuming that it's all, yes, you are. You're assuming that the economy is always what mattered. What this vote shows
but austerity is tied up with the economy.
What this vote shows is that it's culture that matters.
It can be.
Well, it's a lack of politicians connecting with voters. If you look at Jo Cox, she was doing a good job of it. The SNP in Scotland is doing a good job of it. So I think that Labour and the Conservatives both need to put their hands up and admit that they're just not getting it right.
But sorry, your point about those voters in Burnley, they are, at the moment, they're floating voters. A Conservative leader who was as clever as Disraeli. Remember, it's Disraeli who captures the working man's vote in 1867. And there's the possibility now of a Boris or another charismatic Tory politician who invents the national interest.
Let's ask the Remainers whether you think Boris is a healing person.
I think Boris, his speech, it was just extraordinary. That wasn't a victory speech. I think he realises that he's got it wrong and that this is really, really, really serious. And I just hope that we can actually have another referendum, because I think a lot of people actually...
Bad loser.
Bad
loser. Well, I'd rather be a bad loser. I've got more important things to worry about.
I'm not sure it is a bad loser, because people actually feel that they have been lied to, and that's what
people have been lied to.
There's so much more voter regret than I've ever seen before. Most people say,
we're
okay,
now
this
having
is
a clear illustration of why the vote went why it did.
I think people are going to be surprised with Boris Johnson. He's probably the likely next Prime Minister of this country. Actually, you look at his record, he was championing the living wage before other Conservatives. Same-sex marriage, and he opposed the tax credit cuts that George Osborne proposed. He's much more of an interesting Conservative than people think.
The Burnley divide and the metropolitan elite. Paris, what about the generational divide? Because that is really quite striking. The under-45s would have clearly voted to stay in, and the over-45s have clearly voted to take us out.
Well, there was a great headline on Vice today which said, "Grandma, what have you done?" And I think that a lot of millennials will be feeling that this morning. I think it's incredibly selfish, and I personally will not forgive or forget. Because the older generation don't have to live here as long as the younger generation do.
So are we going to introduce, for example, a cut-off point beyond which you can't vote? Well, are you your sense of sublime self-entitlement? No. Are we going to have those under 35 with 2 votes?
Hang on a minute. Young people have already had so much taken away from them. I don't need to take away my airtime as well, Mrs. Starkey. So what we're actually looking at is a generation of people who've... Well, you're not letting me because you're interrupting me, because you're a privileged white man who just wants to speak over me. And this is the problem. Young people are getting very sick of it, sick of being spoken over, sick of being patronised. And we have to pay for our education in a way that your generation didn't have to. You know, we're just, everything that gets taken away, young people are being cut out first. And I think there's a lot of frustration. And, you know, for young people, Europe's just somewhere where we go on holiday and go clubbing. You know, we don't have this xenophobia.
And the young vote is going to be vital in Scotland. Of course, the Scottish referendum included 16-year-olds. They were massive in the turnout. And I think that this is what we also... I noticed Nigel Farage saying, well, we can engage with the Commonwealth. But I've been watching the Australian media who have been saying today, why are we still linked to this country is going to be so diminished, they're going to lose Scotland, possibly Wales, then the Commonwealth is probably due for the chop as well.
This is not what you're... Be careful what you wish for, is this kind of message.
I think at the moment, in our relationship with Europe, we have a situation where people from Africa, Asia, Australasia are actually second-class status when it comes to coming into Britain. We prioritise European. The problem isn't little Englandism, it is little Europeanism. Britain now has the opportunity to open ourselves to the world.
There won't be a Britain this time.
Thank you so much. That is about it. What a 24 hours it's been. Normally, we're meant to be the quietly stable nation that doesn't do revolutions or cut people's heads off, but today we've been rocking the world. That's all we have time for tonight. We will be back with a special programme at 8:30 tomorrow evening on BBC Two. And right now, or as soon as I can get to the green room, we'll be having a continuing conversation on Facebook Live, a chat on that. Go to the Facebook page, ask questions there, and we will talk about them. A few of us talking through the day. Join us for that or for tomorrow. Otherwise, good night.
Every point, every angle. Wimbledon starts Monday at 11:30 on BBC.